Well, good morning. We appreciate so much you taking time out of a busy holiday weekend schedule to be with us today. But I am convinced that by the time that we conclude, you will be glad that you made the decision to be here. My name is Dane Folks. I serve as Associate Director for the Waco Regional Baptist Association, one of 4 groups that are sponsoring this event. I want to say thank you to Baylor University's Institute for Studies in Religion, Baylor University's Center for Ministry Effectiveness and Educational Leadership, and the Restorative Justice Network of Texas, along with the Waco Regional Baptist Association for preparing this event. Just for a moment, there are a number of individuals that have been instrumental in planning and conducting this program today. And I won't take the time to read their names, but I would ask if they would stand for just a moment so that we can recognize them and say thank you for their efforts. Would you stand if you're on that planning group just for a moment, and we want to say thank you. The purpose of this program today is to raise awareness of the significant potential that lies within our faith-based communities, community organizations, and other entities to address the significant needs that we summarize with the term restorative justice. We have an incredible panel today of presenters and respondents. I'm going to, in just a moment, introduce the first presenter and respondent. And then after that, before each session, we'll have someone that will introduce the people that will be participating in that particular session. I will let you know that we're going to have a brief break at the conclusion of this first section so that you can go back out and take care of things. I also wanted to mention that today there is a book table, and just recently released is this incredible book, More God, Less Crime, authored by our first presenter, Dr. Byron Johnson. And you'll want to go and take a look at that. I had the privilege of reading it this week in Philadelphia, and it's an outstanding work that I would love to be able to put in the hand of every person here, but I hope that you'll take advantage of that. I want to introduce our first presenter and respondent, and then we'll pray, and then we'll begin with Dr. Byron Johnson. Byron is Distinguished Professor of the Social Sciences and Director of the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, as well as Director of the Program on Pro-Social Behavior at Baylor University. Before joining the faculty here, he directed research centers at Vanderbilt University and the University of Pennsylvania. He has recently completed a series of studies of the role of religion in pro-social youth behavior as a member of the Coordinating Council for Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. He is a leading authority on the scientific study of religion, the efficacy of faith-based organizations, and criminal justice. He has recently published studies on recidivism reduction and prisoner reentry, and this wonderful book that I believe is going to be a landmark work, More God, Less Crime. Following Dr. Johnson's presentation, there will be a response from Al Barsema, who is Senior Research Associate for Faith-Based and Community Ministries, the Northern Illinois University Center for Governmental Studies. I'd like for us to pray and ask the Lord's blessing on this program today, and even more than that, the results of this program that we will see fleshed out in the days to come. Would you join me as we pray? Our sovereign Lord, we thank you for the day that you've made. We rejoice and we are glad in it. And Father, I thank you that you have brought to this place, in this location for this divine moment, this wide variety of individuals representing so many different entities, but with one common goal, to learn more of how we can be a part of establishing your kingdom among these that so desperately need you. Lord, I thank you for those who have given their time, who have given back to you their talents, and who will share with us the insight that you have provided them. Lord, I pray that you will do that work of your Spirit, which will give us eyes to see and ears to hear, discerning hearts. And then, Lord, as we leave this place, a sense of excitement about being a part of something that is kingdom-sized, but, Lord, as small as every individual that we meet. Thank you for your presence in this place and for inviting us to join you. In Jesus' name, amen. Dr. Byron Johnson.
Thank you, Dane. It is good to be here with you all today to talk about these issues that matter so much to all of us. This book that you're seeing on the screen was released just this week. It is my first book project, except for a couple of books that I've edited. Over the last 25 years, I've done empirical studies for journals that scholars read and nobody else does. So we use obscure methods to prove what is obvious to most common people. But after 25 years of conducting empirical studies, I felt like it was time to write a book that would capture, in a lay-friendly way, what all the research seems to speak to, and this is the book. So I hope you will get it. When I talked to the editor of the press that published this book, they came to Baylor and met with me, and they said, "Well, let's hear your story." And I said, "Well, how far back do you want to go?" And so I shared with them something that happened in my life at the beginning of my academic career. And they said, "That's chapter 1 of your book." And I said, "Well, I would prefer that not be in the book at all because I have not talked about this publicly." And they said, "No, you have to talk about it because it will help with the rest of the book." So chapter 1 of the book is in fact my testimony. So if you go back into the early days of my academic career, I was teaching at Memphis State University, and I've always been kind of a on fire for God Christian. And there was a reason why I was referred to as John the Baptist at Memphis State University, where I taught. I was always getting in trouble for sharing my faith. So it didn't matter, students, faculty members alike, I was sharing my faith everywhere I could. A lot of Christians that I knew were offended by it. There were some Christians on campus that actually said to me, "It's appropriate that students don't know that they are Christians. This, in fact, says that they're doing a good job of communicating the material in an unbiased and neutral way." Of course, I always disagree with that position. But at the end of my 4th year at Memphis State, I was asked to leave. Right before I was to apply for tenure. My evaluations were not outstanding, they were good. My student evaluations were very high. I had published. I had done all the things that you're supposed to do as an academic, but I was asked to leave without the option of even applying for tenure. This is all documented in chapter 1. Why do I mention it? I mention it because people of faith that are very visible and outspoken in their faith run against the grain, and this is exactly what the provost at Memphis told me, who was a Christian. He said, "I hate what's happened to you. I hate it. I like you. You're a smart guy, but you need to be in a Christian university." And I said, "Well, look, I'm not called to be in a Christian university. How could I have ever dreamed I'd be at Baylor one day?" But I said, "I'm supposed to be at a secular university. I'm good at what I do." And he said that you'll never make it in a secular university. And 8 years later, I was running a major research center at Vanderbilt University, just down the road from Memphis. I mention it because those of you that seek to do this work and those of you that are already doing this work have already faced the last acceptable prejudice. And it's prejudice against people who think that faith is transformative in and of itself. And I've seen people that do ministry, various kinds of ministry, that have run into all kinds of roadblocks. And so for whatever it's worth, I think I know what you've experienced. I've experienced it in my own life. But what's the appropriate response to prejudice? I think the appropriate response is not to get even. It's not to, as some people would say, seek justice. I think the appropriate response is to do justice. It is to do good work at the highest imaginable levels that we can do. This is where I actually run into problems with people that are in ministry, because sometimes I don't think they do put in their best efforts. But I think that's what we're called to do. In the book, I talk about several outstanding ministries, because I wanted to be able to make the case that faith matters. And so I tell 3 stories. These are all different chapters in the book, and I'm only going to touch on them briefly here. But the Boston Miracle is a story that took place in the 1990s. Violent crime in Boston was at an all-time high in 1990, 152 homicides. Youth violence was off the charts. The police did not know what to do. People were frustrated. They were afraid. And one day, a young boy was killed in a drive-by shooting. He had belonged to a gang. Well, at the funeral service, another gang shows up and barges into the church and begins shooting at and in a church. Well, that was enough. A number of churches got together and said, we have to do something. These very churches have been critical of police. So the police partnered with the churches, and what happened in Boston is well documented, and I've talked about it in chapter 2. They drove the youth homicide rate down to 0. They went over 18 months without a fatality in Boston. People from all around the country and even around the world were traveling to Boston to see what was happening there. This was literally a handful of congregations, black churches, that completely turned the tide of youth violence in Boston. I also talk about how the Boston Miracle literally began to shape what they were doing in other police departments around the country in major urban centers. The story of the Boston Miracle is a powerful one because it shows you don't need an army to affect change. You can do it with a few people that are committed. And it also shows one thing, that the churches weren't able to stem it by themselves, and neither were the police, the prosecutors, those in government service. It was a partnership. The next story I talk about is the Ammachi story in Philadelphia. Before the year 2000, there was next to no conversation in this country about children of prisoners. You can easily argue that children of prisoners are the most at-risk group in America. There are all kinds of ways you could operationalize who's most at risk, but it's hard to imagine someone more at risk than someone who has one or both parents incarcerated. But there had been no research on them and no data collected on them. In fact, no one knew how many children of prisoners there were in the country. So around 2000, John DiIulio, along with a few people in Philadelphia, and I happened to be there myself at the University of Pennsylvania, we launched something called the Ammachi initiative to target children of prisoners. Little did we know how quickly it would grow. In the period of 10 years, 100,000 mentors were matched with children of prisoners across the United States. It is a remarkable story. We academics talk about things like this. It's not much if you can have an anecdote. You're going to, in fact, hear some anecdotes today. You're going to hear from some people who will share their testimony, and it will be very powerful. But in and of themselves, I would argue these don't mean much unless you have data that corroborates these testimonies. The Ammachi story is an incredible example of how you take an anecdote and you multiply it times 100,000. It's staggering. And what it shows is that faith community, in partnership with other groups, can have a scalable impact on any number of social problems. And that's the beautiful thing behind the Ammachi story. In another chapter, I talk about Robert Woodson. Some of you may know who Robert Woodson is. He was very active in the civil rights movement. Robert Woodson formed something called the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise in Washington, D.C., and one of the things he was concerned about was violence in our schools. So he launched something called the Violence-Free Zone, and we have now conducted about 3 different studies of the Violence-Free Zone, where they have gone into communities, into schools, and had an enormous impact, such that now public schools from across the country are saying, please come help us. They take what they call these mentors are really what they are. They're mentors, but they take them into schools and they connect with students in and outside of schools, and they know and anticipate whenever there's going to be a problem. It's remarkable what's happened in Milwaukee, Richmond, Baltimore. They're now in Dallas and going all across the country. This is just another example of a faith-based approach to crime prevention that we now have evidence works. But beyond that, do we have a bunch of other studies, or is this a brand new area where we have little research? Let me move a little quicker here. So I have reviewed all the literature of any study that's looked at religion and crime and or delinquency. These are empirical studies. These are not qualitative studies. These are empirical studies where people have gathered large amounts of data. And it may be too small to see from where you sit, but in the left column, those are studies that deal with the issue of drug use. And in the middle, these are studies that deal with delinquency, and on the right, studies that deal with alcohol. These are all studies with kids, delinquents, or delinquency. The blue column represents those studies where we find that the more religion increases, the likelihood decreases of a harmful outcome. So if you look at the size of the columns, what you see there is that faith matters in not just a little way, in a dramatic way, not in one study, but in hundreds of studies. These are not studies conducted by Christians. There may be some Christians who've conducted these studies, but believe me, people in sociology and psychology in the fields that I represent, it's very rare to find Christians that are out there doing this work. So I would argue most of these studies are done by people that have no faith commitment whatsoever. And the evidence is overwhelming. I've also reviewed studies in a host of other areas, and we find the same kinds of trends. About 90% of the studies find a beneficial effect. And it's interesting, if you look at the column there that says that's white, that means religion had a harmful outcome. You see one study out of 263 associated with a harmful outcome. It's pretty dramatic. In fact, I've been looking for studies with a harmful outcome. I've been praying that God might let me do one myself because it would make me famous overnight. He actually found that religion is harmful. That's what so many want to hear. But I haven't been able to find it. God has yet to answer that prayer. It's very disturbing. Now, some of you do prison work, and you go into jails or you go into prisons, and you do all kinds of ministry. Does that matter? Well, we have a few studies on that, and I've done most of them, but it's growing. There are a number of people now that have joined me in this area. And so one of the things that I've been interested in is, can these faith-based programs have an impact? So I studied Bible studies. Prison Fellowship, for example, does a series of Bible studies in prisons. They also do other programs, and I wanted to see if they had a long-term effect on recidivism. I found that their other programs didn't work, but guess what? The Bible studies do. They have an effect. They reduce recidivism, and in the studies that I completed were published in Justice Quarterly, one of the top journals in the field. So it's not just my word. It was a study that was refereed by other people and published in one of the best journals. So we know that it works with recidivism, but what if that was just Bible studies? What if you could do a whole faith-based program? And so I evaluated the Interchange Freedom Initiative in Houston. This was a 6-year study, and it was launched in 1997. I completed it in 2003. And as you can see here, the results are not what one would hope for. The Interchange Freedom Initiative people are in the purple column. And the red column, I think that's the color you're seeing, the red column represents those people that were matched. In other words, they look just like the people in the faith-based program, but they did not get the intervention. They were not in the faith-based program. And what you can see there is that the rates are almost identical for rearrest on the left and on incarceration on the right, who comes back. So this is not good news. Now, there are some reasons why that happened. The program was new, just getting started. It had issues. But one of the main reasons was a third of the inmates were paroled long before they could ever complete the program. When some got to the program, they found out it was Christian. They didn't know it was Christian. They wanted to leave. They could leave anytime they want. It's a voluntary program. But what happens if you look at people who completed that program? This is what happens. they're significantly less likely to be rearrested. They're significantly less likely to go back to prison. Now keep in mind, I just showed you that for the whole group, it didn't work. But for those people that completed the program, it was very effective, and it did work. This is an important finding. I will let you know that a new study has just been completed within the last few weeks in Minnesota, also of the Interchange Freedom Initiative, completed by the state of Minnesota, where they find a significant reduction in arrest as well as incarceration for the entire participant group. People who completed it or didn't complete it, they find the effect that I was hoping to find in Texas, then we didn't. And they talk about the Texas study throughout their own study, and they argue the reason why we didn't find an effect in Texas was largely because it was a startup program. If we were to go back and reevaluate, who knows what we might find. So the Minnesota study, which will be published soon, keep your eyes out, is the first one to show an effect for the overall group. Now, what did I find mattered? This comes back to people like you. Mentoring mattered. Those inmates who received a mentor and whose mentor stuck with them, and ditto for the inmates who stuck with their mentors, they were less likely to come back to prison. I can't emphasize enough the importance of mentoring for these prisoners, and even more so in aftercare than going into the prison. I could talk for an hour on the importance of mentoring and the importance of what we have to do in aftercare. I can't emphasize enough how important that is, and there are reasons why. I wish I could fly through this more. It's in the book, but I do talk about spiritual transformation. It's funny. This makes people so uncomfortable in the secular world, they don't want to talk about spiritual transformation. Did we see that there was spiritual transformation going on? We absolutely saw that, and I interviewed prisoners for 6 years. I interviewed them time and time again, and then I went back and coded those interviews, and this is what I found, that there were these markers of spiritual transformation, what you and I would refer to as spiritual growth. And I don't have enough time to go into all of these things, but let me just say this. Picture yourself, raised in poverty, you're in trouble as a teen, you flunk out of school, you wind up in real trouble and you go to prison. You get out and you go back, you get out and you go back. Now you're what they call a 3-time loser. You've done some pretty bad things in your life. But because of all that you've been through, do you want to acknowledge that your life has turned out to be horrible and that you yourself have not been a pleasant person? No one wants to do that. So what do many offenders do? They basically distance themselves. They deny. They blame the system. They blame others for their situation. What happens for an offender that comes to faith, it allows them for the first time to reconcile their past. I did do it. I'm not trying to say I didn't do it. I actually did do it, but that's a different person. I have become a new person. I now understand what it means. I'm reconciled to this now because I have found faith and I have found forgiveness. And offenders are able to what we call rewrite the narratives of their life. It's a very powerful thing. It's something that you go, well, of course. But for many, this is so important because it allows them to start remaking their lives. But there's a big problem, and here it is. So these people find the Lord in prison, a lot of them, but that doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory. And this is the problem that I have with so many of my Christian brethren that I've talked to about this topic, because they think, some of them at least, have told me to my face, they've done their job, they've introduced them to Jesus. It's like the old Brill Cream commercial, a little dabble do ya. And the reality is, it's inaccurate. And so what I tell these people is, yes, you've introduced them to Jesus, and they will be bringing Jesus back with them to prison. That's the reality, because of these obstacles that are on the screen. In essence, what we're here today largely to talk about is how to do this, okay? And how to encourage people to do more than going into prisons and sharing with a Bible study. How can we do more? This is the real work. This is the hard work. This is the work that some people won't do because it's so much easier to go into a prison in a weird way, it's a much safer way to approach ministry than going into the communities and confronting each of these obstacles. So I'm going to fly through this. There have been some federal, there's a Ready for Work program that has had success in the 2000s where they targeted for reentry a lot of these issues that I'm talking about. Then there was the Prisoner Reentry Initiative. The beautiful thing about the Prisoner Reentry Initiative in the 2000s was that this was money from the federal government to community groups and to faith-based groups to do reentry where all those obstacles that I showed you were confronted head-on, or at least that was the target. And they did not discriminate against the faith-based groups, which is really fantastic and shows we're making some progress. Now, I won't go into all the results from the Prisoners Reentry Initiative, but just know the preliminary findings are very encouraging. So, these are the solutions that today we should debate and talk about to what I would call prisoner reentry and aftercare. Summing up, these are the ones. And as I've indicated, transformation is important. Even now, scientists are beginning to say the only way you can rehabilitate someone is if something cognitively happens in their brain. There has to be a starting point to a change. And they're admitting that spiritual transformation is one of those factors. So and then the other thing that you all know, the last bullet there, transformation is an ongoing process. It's something that is a continued project. I coined this phrase, all solutions are local. I talk about it in the book. Tip O'Neill's father once said, all politics are local. We have the former mayor with us today, and I'm sure she would agree with this statement, all politics are local. And you could argue all solutions are local. And that's been Robert Woodson's rallying cry as well. And this is why the faith community is so vital to everything that we're going to be talking about today. Volunteers are critical. I don't know how many of you volunteer, but I'm assuming a lot of you in this room are volunteers. This is the gold for me. And the reason why is we now know who volunteers more than anybody else. It's people of faith. Do you know how many religious congregations there are in America? Over 375,000. Bob Putnam from Harvard here in this quote basically argues that houses of worship represent this great resource for us. And I think that he's absolutely right in saying this. Intermediaries. Today you're going to hear more on this from Mike Doyle, who runs the Cornerstone Assistance Network in Fort Worth. This has been the missing link. All those obstacles that you saw on the screen earlier, how do you tackle them? Are you supposed to tackle all of them? Well, maybe some of you are called to do educational work. Maybe some of you are called to do mentoring. Maybe some of you are called to help in housing or job placement. And the intermediary is a rare animal. It doesn't exist in most communities. But they do exist. And you're going to hear today how they are Grand Central Station for plugging together resources and need. They told us not to do what I just did. Or one would be electrocuted. So intermediaries are absolutely essential to our efforts. So real quick, if you look at reentry and you look at the left side of that diagram, you see prison. You see 700,000 people a year coming out of prison. Most of these people go on parole. And then that red line from parole goes right down to all those obstacles that they face, and that's why 2/3 of them go back. Okay? It's not rocket science. People say, I'm just so frustrated, the recidivism rate is so high. I'm always shocked it's so low. Only 2/3? That's remarkable. The reality is there are probably some reasons why the other third aren't locked up, but it's probably not good. If you look at the right side, this is where we need to be. The right side of that slide are all these obstacles, or at least a chunk of them. And you can see congregations there as one of the circles. And then in the middle, I put the intermediaries. intermediaries that at least I know of and others need to be there, and this is what we need to think about. This is just a study that we just completed. It's not even out yet. It's done. It's going to be on our website. I've been able over the years to work with Prison Fellowship to tell them that they need to put more emphasis in the community instead of in prisons. And I think it's actually kind of getting through, and they have now launched something called Out for Life. It's a program that basically targets reentry. And so we've just completed a study of Out for Life that will be released in Chicago in July, and it will be on our website. You'll be able to get it. And this is the book that will be on display outside. I hope you'll get it. I think it'll be very helpful to you. The thing I like about it is the book is chock full of data. I don't like it when people try to convince me of what their opinion is. I really don't care what their opinion is. I want to know what the data say. And so for Christians, to have data to arm them in their arguments is something that they need. And oftentimes they have resisted, and we haven't come and reasoned well with people. So I think the book will help fill that gap. And then this is our website where you can get all kinds of studies and information. You can download them. They're free. And that's it. I'm going to answer questions in just a minute, but before I do, I'm going to ask my good friend Al Barsema to come up and respond to me. Al?
Thank you, Byron. When Byron asked me to come up here and speak, whoops, I said I would love to. He said, you can do a rebuttal. I said, rebuttal? I thought we were supposed to be on the same team. He said, you could agree, disagree, whatever you want to do about the book. I'm here happy to say the book came out before this conference, so I was able to actually read it, and I wholeheartedly agree. I'm going to fly through. If Byron flied through, I'm going to really fly through. I have about 5 minutes left here now. So I want to buckle your seatbelts. We're going to take a fast trip. Take a look and kind of multitask. What we have up here is a quote from the, it's a little intimidating to come and speak beside somebody that the first word in his title is distinguished. But the distinguished Byron Johnson has this quote in his book. Any prisoner reentry plan that is comprehensive and able to reach the scale will require a massive influx of new people and programs that do not currently exist in most jurisdictions. Since the government alone cannot provide these programs, faith and community-based groups represent a critical piece of the reentry puzzle that has yet to be tapped in any systematic fashion. Another one by Timothy Keller. Every Christian is to be a people helper, yet the church herself has almost completely conceded this work to secular agencies and authorities. Okay. My wife and I started a homeless outreach center pushing 10 years ago, actually it's a little bit over 10 years ago, in Rockford, Illinois. And faith-based homeless outreach center, but I've been heads down for the last 10 years dealing primarily with governmental and traditional social service entities because that's where the services were that we required to help the chronically homeless, many of which were incarcerated, get out of the distressed situation they're in. It's just an observation that the churches were pretty much on the periphery, food pantries, clothes closets, all necessary things, but they were not dead center in the human service delivery system. We think it's time for that to change, and we'd like to see churches and faith-based organizations get directly in the center. There's a couple of observations that we had as we move forward, been moving forward for the last 10 years. One that's up here is pretty obvious, especially with the economy of recent. Service needs are increasing in all arenas, with incarcerates, with poverty in general, with homelessness, with truancy. There's a lot of service needs increasing. Resources are decreasing on a national basis and certainly in Illinois. Governmental and traditional social services are admitting that they cannot do it alone. Hence, President Bush started the community and faith-based initiatives. Churches and centers of faith, as Byron relayed, we're all convinced are vast, virtually untapped, underutilized centers of resources that have financial, physical, human resources that we can mobilize. Kind of seeing a movement where they want to do that. Exterior focused church movement, missional renaissance movement, the church is recognizing we need to get outside of our walls and get into the community and start actually being a part of person-centered ministry. And not just project-centered, but person-centered, individual, one-on-one. Keep an eye on here. There we go, my only animated slide. Did you like that? The little guys running around there initially they represented a chronically homeless person. It could be a reentrant, somebody that is needing to get out of a distressed condition. In Rockford, we noticed the one, and all of these little buildings, houses there represent social service agencies or entities. I always emphasize these are wonderful people doing wonderful things. But because of funding, quite often, they're kind of isolated. They're funded to do one or a small handful of things, and they do that very well. They're specialists in that. But there was no central nervous system to tie everything together. So in Rockford, somebody would go to the Red Cross homeless shelter. They need that, excellent service. 7:30, they had to get out. They go to a church that would provide breakfast for 100 homeless folks. Needed, 9:30, they're back on the street. They go to Crusader Clinic for free medical. Excellent service, but after that they're on the street. Somewhere else to get some clothes, somewhere else to get a bag of food, somewhere to maybe get a temp job that might go to support their addiction, back to the shelter. And they were stuck in this little loop here, surviving but not thriving. The core issues that were keeping them down, maybe an addiction issue to alcohol, drugs, sexual gambling, personality disorders, relationship problems, domestic violence, no child care, no transportation to get around, all of those life issues. Nobody was looking at the whole person really to put that package together and make sure that they can thrive. So the agencies were being successful, passing out the things they were funded to pass out, but the poor guy running around in the loop was not successful. So what if, it's kind of a visionary thing here, what if churches and centers of faith, we pioneered a new model. What if each provided a needed service? We can do a gap analysis in communities, find out what services are needed, what services are provided, what are the gaps, and how can we collectively start to fill those gaps. So we're providing a needed service, and then we work holistically and collaboratively together. Scenario, have a probation director sitting right next to me down here, anxious to talk with Chip more, but single mother, single parent, could be a dad also coming out of jail or prison, is probably going to need a multiple of services. You see it up here. Stable housing, stable transportation, mentoring for mom, tutoring for the kids, childcare. All of those things are needed. The church can provide all of those resources, and we can do it quite well. So we're piloting a demonstration project. We recently formed One Body Collaboratives, whose mission is to mobilize and coordinate church and faith-based resources. We've kind of partnered up with Baylor, Institute for Studies of Religion, and Northern Illinois University, Center for Governmental Studies that I work for, and we're going to look for communities that we can implement some of these methods and tools in. Byron had 12 areas of life up there which match directly with my 14 that we have. I have identification and belongings on there also. Some people may say I've got 13 out of 14, I'm good, I'm golden. But take any one of these, look at them. If you're missing it, it could knock you out of the saddle. And as Byron said, we also need to recognize spirituality alone is not just the answer. It's not to say this simple prayer and life is okay, because they're still dealing with all of the other issues. So we're going to have a collaborative delivery model where we're working with it all together. We have a technology platform that can do an assessment, all 14 areas. You can get very quickly through this, identify core issues, put goals for those issues, steps to attain those goals, link with the resources, and monitor it all through one central plan. Mission control screen, my goals I'm working on, all my case notes, everything is right there. HIPAA compliant sharing. So if a gentleman up there wants to work on housing, you put in the housing goals and notes. You put in the employment goals and notes. You put in your mentoring notes. And everybody's working on the same plan. It's kind of a paradigm shift in the way of doing business. Instead of not knowing what left hand what the right hand is doing, we're all working on the same plan for an individual or family. Does it work? With the Carpenters Place in Rockford, for over the last multiple years, we've been seeing over 300 long-term homeless get stabilized in housing. We've reduced recidivism. By the county's admission, it was 85, 88% for the population we deal with, got that down to 18%. Drastic reduction in jail stay days. Bottom line, saved the county $348,000 in 1 year with 88 participants just for jail stay days alone. The demonstration project, some things that it could provide here, and I'm out of time, so I'm going to just say that we are looking for coalitions of the willing anywhere in the United States and or beyond. They are there. There's church coalitions that recognize, hey, we need some tools to coordinate. We need to look at things holistically and collaboratively. We're looking for those so that we can all work together. My second animated slide. This is my contact information. I do have a flyer up by the table upstairs. Get one of these so that you can please contact me if you have any desire to learn more. Would love to. You've been a great, I want to thank Byron for his book, More God, Less Crime. It's exactly what we need. I want to thank you for being here today on a beautiful Saturday. Give yourself a hand.
We're open for questions and answers. There we go. We have a few minutes before we take a break.
Adam, how are you able to pull this off? Thank you for
Question was how I was able to pull that off at a state university. Good question. The director of the Center for Governmental Studies is I met him about 4 or 5 years ago. Northern Illinois University actually hosts the database on their servers. Their staff actually does the programming on it now. And I met the Center for Governmental Studies, and he said, Al, what you're working on is the holy grail of human service delivery. If you can get governmental entities, traditional social service, and the faith entities all to work together on one plan, that's the holy grail. So when we formed Community Collaboration, which is that organization which promotes or distributes the tools, Bob said, Al, would you come over to the university to promote social innovation from under the university's banner? I said I would, but you need to recognize that my passion now is to see the church, local churches, utilize these tools so we can mobilize them. He said, fine, great. We recognize that we need it. So it was by their invitation. I said I need faith on my card. He said, no problem. I have a letter from the president of the university, President Peters, saying congratulations on starting One Body Collaboratives. We're supported in any way we can. So it's a blessing from God. Thank you.
Virginia.
Question, are we spawning in other cities and any indexes? Yes, we've been, Community Collaboration, which is the second entity we formed to distribute these tools, got launched in early 2007. There's initiatives in Minneapolis. There was 60-some faith-based and church organizations that were working on reentry and youth issues. They started with the provider database, inventorying their assets and their marshaling in the collaborative case management. Some political leaders found out about it, and business folks, and using the tools in North Side Achievement Zone. It's a high poverty district that they're working in. They're utilized in Cincinnati in the Department of Labor grant for mentoring. Our community has 26 organizations that are utilizing the tools, including Department of Human Service, the Housing Authority, Salvation Army, etc. So there are communities out there that are utilizing them. Now, a lot of it is with the governmental and social service world, so it's kind of a new thrust for us to specifically target church and faith organizations. And indexes, that's why I got Byron on the team. We are collecting this data. We just walk through a plan. These are tools that case managers want to use, and in the course of doing business, you need an ID card. Okay, we got the birth certificate, we got the school transcripts, we got the money, we got the whole ID card. We're gathering data as we're doing work, so there's going to be a phenomenal pool for mining data. Gentleman up there.
Well, it is absolutely essential. We convened a meeting here at Baylor about 2 years ago of people that were interested in aftercare for women coming out of Gatesville. I was struck when I moved to Waco that they had so many women confined so close to Waco, and a number of us went out and visited that prison. We thought, well, maybe we should do something like a halfway house for women, and we brought together, we advertised and had a meeting, and we brought together a bunch of people. And it was really fascinating because what you found was that they were here. People were here. They were doing ministries. But they were all disconnected from each other, largely. And this is the same story from town to town. So you have people that are called to do work. They don't know what to do except to pick up their Bible and knock on a door and do some work. This is going to sound a little bit more harsh than I want to sound, but a lot of these folks, I call them mom and pop operations. They're not very sophisticated. They can't apply for a grant. They don't have a computer. They don't have a printer. And intermediaries, as you're going to hear a little bit later on, are organizations that bring together people that are very gifted and talented, people from the business world, people who know how to get grants, but that are motivated out of their faith, to connect these people with all these desires to do the right thing. They just need someone to help them. They need some coaching. They need some resources. And so what these intermediaries do is they take need on the one hand, resources on the other hand, and then they bring this capacity building behind it. So I don't want to go into it too much because there are people that are much more knowledgeable than me about this. But see, I think this is the problem so far with many of our ministries. I would say they're anorexic. They do what they can do. It's kind of like you were saying, you know, they're surviving, but they're not thriving. And if we could ever figure out how to establish a muscular entity that sought to, their reason for being was to help other people do better what they already do and give them the tools. And, you know, we have to get over this issue of turf. There's so much envy that I see between these groups. You know, it happens. It happens to all of us. So I think these intermediaries are so critical to us. Now, how do you form them? It's a tough nut to crack, and I think that's why we wanted to have Al here, because he may not consider himself an intermediary with these tools, but he is. And you're going to hear from Mike Doyle in the third session about a muscular intermediary in Fort Worth. It's really changing the Metroplex. That's what you're going to hear about in the third session. And then, Lord willing, we're going to launch an intermediary here in Waco that will help all the faith-based groups succeed in what it is that they're wanting to do. So that's one of the reasons why we want to have this symposium today, is to gauge the level of interest from the community out there. And so stay tuned. Great question. Thank you. Chapter 11 of the book. It's the last chapter. It's intermediaries. There's a reason why it was the last chapter. It's the most important piece. I think we could just have a couple more minutes. Maybe one more question before we break. Yes, ma'am. You know, it goes both ways. And again, you'll have some people that will address that issue in probably in the third session. We have with us the head of the One Star Foundation today, Liz Darling. I have seen people in the faith community that want to get as far away as they can from the government. The government is toxic to them. Okay? So in fact, the prejudice goes both ways. The government is evil. And then there are people in the government that think that faith is toxic. And really what we have to do is to kind of come together. And I'll tell a quick story. I was in a prison in Kansas, and they had 5 dorms, male prison. One of the dorms was a faith-based dorm. And so I went in there and I interviewed a caseworker. And he thought this faith-based dorm that he was working in was a complete and utter joke. All these religious volunteers, bunch of do-gooders, he hated them all. And he said, there's one way to deal with inmates, and it's the way I deal with inmates. And it's like, I get down and dirty more than they do. Every other word out of his mouth was a 4-letter word. The inmates hated him, and he hated the inmates, and he hated this faith-based program, and let me know it. I came back 3 months later and interviewed him, and it was like I was talking to a different person. And you know, it's kind of like, okay, you know, so I'm not hearing any cussing at all. And then I come back 3 months later and interview him again. Well, you know, he hadn't become a believer, but honestly, the transformation was amazing. I talked to other correctional officers about this guy. They go, he's completely changed. He's completely changed. He was bragging about the program. I remember he said to me, I realized when I saw these faith-based folks talking to this inmate, they say, you can't do that. You became a Christian. Here's a scripture that says you cannot behave the way you're behaving. And he goes, so I've actually been using scripture against the inmates. And the guy himself, 6 months later, thought this was something that was the most horrible development. These faith-based people don't know what they're doing, and they're going to come in here, they're going to get us all killed because they don't have any sense. They don't want to be trained. A little bit of truth in that, but largely not true. They did want to be trained, the people from the outside. And I guess I say this to those people that think the government is toxic. I would say that guy needed the salt that the believers in the faith-based program brought to the prison. He became a better state employee because he was constantly rubbing shoulders with people of faith. This is why I think that people that err so far on the side of separation in church and state that they forget that we can't allow the state to be without God. You know, the state needs God. And we need the state because, you know what, we get carried away with how successful we are and we haven't proven anything. That's why I wanted to write the book. It took me 20 years to get it written because we didn't have enough evidence for me to write it. Now we do. But a lot of times we brag. Our programs are not only effective, they're perfect, 100%. They're not 100% effective. And so, anyways, so it goes both ways. And I think we should take a break. Thank you.